The screaming started at 9:48 a.m. Victor's hands moved before his mind caught up. Muscle memory from Graz, from the killing fields of Bosnia, from 20 years of making monsters pay. His fingers found the Glock 19 hidden beneath the kitchen sink, while Rex's whimpers cut through the Montana morning like a serrated blade. "Jesus, Crusher, you really launched that mutt," laughed the skinny one with the spider tattoo crawling up his neck. "Thing went flying like a football." "Shut up, Webb," Crusher grunted, his leather vest straining over a gut that hadn't seen a sit-up in decades. The death's head patch on his back was faded, worn. Old man's probably calling the cops already. Victor wasn't calling anyone. He was 20 feet away, hidden behind the woodpile, watching 3 men in their 30s circle his injured dog like vultures. Rex lay on his side, breathing in short, desperate pants, one hind leg bent at an impossible angle. The third biker, younger than the others with prison ink covering his arms, kicked dirt at Rex's face. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Dog got your tongue?" He cupped his hands around his mouth. "We know you're out here, you old piece of shit." Breathe, count, assess. The lessons from Colonel Brenner echoed in Victor's skull. Never let emotion drive the weapon. Emotion gets you killed. But Rex whimpered again, and Victor felt something crack inside his chest. Something that had been held together by morning routines and evening pills, and the carefully constructed fiction that he was just a harmless retiree who fed birds and fixed fence posts. Crusher pulled out a beer, cracked it open at 9:49 a.m., and poured half of it over Rex's head. "Here's to Montana hospitality, boys. Real friendly folk out here." The spider-tattooed one, Webb, laughed and unzipped his jeans. "Yeah, let me show this mutt some real hospitality." Victor's finger found the trigger. Stop. Think. Plan. 3 targets. Open ground between the woodpile and the house. His truck was 30 yards to the left. Theirs was parked crooked in his driveway, blocking easy escape routes. They were drunk, sloppy, probably armed but overconfident. He'd killed 16 men in situations with worse odds. But that was 30 years ago, when his joints didn't creak and his eyes didn't need reading glasses. When Maria was alive to remind him there was something worth staying human for. Maria, who'd rescued Rex from the shelter during her chemo treatments, who'd whispered in Victor's ear during the bad nights when the ghosts got too loud, "Promise me you won't go back to that darkness. Promise me Rex will keep you anchored." Webb finished relieving himself on Victor's dog and zipped up, grinning. "Think the old bastard ran? Maybe called his buddies at the shuffleboard club?" "Nah." The young one with the prison tats kicked Rex in the ribs, hard, probably having a heart attack. "These mountain hermits are all talk until the real world shows up." Rex yelped, a sound like breaking glass, and tried to crawl away on 3 legs. Victor closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, the man who'd fed birds and fixed fence posts was gone. What remained was something the Bosnian war criminals had called Shatten, the shadow. The thing that came for you in the night when all your sins finally caught up. He moved like smoke between the trees, circling wide to flank them from the north. His joints didn't creak anymore. His hands didn't shake. 30 years of rust fell away like old paint. Target 1, Webb. Skinny, nervous energy, knife on his left hip, probably a tweaker based on the way he kept scratching his neck. Quick but weak. Target 2, Crusher. Big, slow, confident. Gun bulge under his left armpit, right-handed draw. Dangerous but predictable. Target 3, Prison Tats. Young, watchful, coiled. His eyes swept the tree line every few seconds. Combat experience, maybe. The real threat. Victor reached the drainage ditch behind his barn and belly crawled through 20 feet of mud and barbed wire. The Glock felt warm in his palm, familiar, like greeting an old friend. At 9:52 a.m., he had clean shots on all 3. At 9:53 a.m., Webb kicked Rex again, and the dog went limp. Something inside Victor's chest didn't just crack, it shattered completely. The carefully constructed life of Victor Steiner, widowed retiree, dissolved like sugar in rain. What emerged from the wreckage was older, colder, and infinitely more patient. Shatten smiled in the Montana dirt and began to plan their deaths. But first, He needed to know why 3 Hell's Angels had driven 800 miles to torture an old man's dog, because this felt personal, planned. Like someone had been watching him, learning his routines, finding his pressure points. Like someone knew exactly who Victor Steiner used to be, and that someone had just made the last mistake they'd ever make. Are you hooked? Drop a comment telling me where you're reading from. I love connecting with readers around the world. And if this story has its claws in you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's chapter reveals Victor's first move. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when a professional killer decides to come out of retirement. The Montana dirt was cold against Victor's chest, but it couldn't match the ice spreading through his veins as he watched Rex's shallow breathing grow more labored. Each rise and fall of his dog's ribs was a countdown timer. To what? Victor couldn't say. Maybe to sanity. Maybe to the last shred of the man Maria had believed he could become. "You're not that person anymore," she'd whispered during one of his nightmares, her cancer-thin fingers tracing the scar across his collarbone. "Der Schatten died in Bosnia. You're Victor now. Just Victor." But Rex's blood was seeping into the gravel of his driveway, and Victor could feel the old programming clicking back online like circuits in a machine that had never really been shut down, only sleeping. The Hell's Angels were getting restless. Crusher finished his beer and crushed the can against his thigh, the aluminum crumpling with a sharp crack that made Victor's trigger finger twitch. Webb was pacing now, his spider tattoo writhing as he rolled his shoulders, that tweaker energy looking for another outlet. The young one with the prison ink kept checking his phone, glancing at the tree line, then back at Rex. Why here? Why now? Victor's ranch sat on 800 acres of nothing, bordered by Glacier National Park on 3 sides. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles down a dirt road that most GPS systems didn't even recognize. He'd chosen this place specifically for its isolation, somewhere the ghosts of Sarajevo and Srebrenica couldn't follow him. Somewhere Maria could die in peace, watching eagles circle the mountain peaks instead of listening to sirens and gunfire that existed only in her husband's fractured sleep. But isolation was a double-edged blade. No witnesses meant no limits. Webb kicked a beer bottle toward Rex, the glass shattering against the dog's back. "Come on out, Grandpa. We're just getting started, with your mutt. Maybe we'll take him for a ride, see how fast he can run behind our bikes." The young one, Victor had started thinking of him as ink, grabbed Webb's arm. "Enough. We're here for information, not torture." Information. The word hit Victor like a rifle shot. This wasn't random violence or boredom or even simple cruelty. Someone had sent them. Someone who knew enough about Victor Steiner to understand that the fastest way to break him was through Rex, through Maria's last gift. 5 years ago, she'd driven herself to the animal shelter in Kalispell during a good day between chemo sessions. Victor had found her in the parking lot afterward, tears streaming down her face as a German Shepherd puppy slept in her lap. They were going to put him down tomorrow, she'd said. "His name is Rex. He reminds me of you, all alone and pretending he doesn't need anyone." Rex had been Maria's shadow through the final months, sleeping beside her hospital bed, somehow knowing when the pain was too much for her to bear human company. After the funeral, when Victor had spent 3 days sitting in his truck outside the Kalispell gun shop, debating whether A45 under the chin would hurt less than waking up alone, Rex had simply climbed into the passenger seat and refused to leave. The dog had saved his life by existing. Now Rex was dying in Victor's driveway, and 3 men in Hell's Angels colors were discussing whether to drag him behind their motorcycles. Crusher lit a cigarette, the flame from his Zippo casting brief shadows across his face. "Check the house. See if the old man's hiding under his bed." "House is locked," Ink said, "and I'm not breaking and entering for your entertainment. Since when do you care about breaking the law? Since we're supposed to be asking questions, not playing games." Victor shifted his weight, feeling the familiar ache in his left knee where Serb shrapnel had found home during the siege of Gorazde. That was 1994. Clinton was president. Victor was 38 years old and believed he was saving the world, one dead war criminal at a time. The world had other plans. Now he was 68. His hair more silver than brown, his face mapped with lines that spoke of too much sun and not enough sleep. But his hands were steady, his eyes were clear. and muscle memory was a river that ran deeper than time. Webb pulled out his phone. "Should I call him?" "Not yet," Ink said. "Give the old man 10 more minutes to show himself. If he doesn't, then we escalate." Victor's blood crystallized into something harder than ice. Someone was orchestrating this. Someone with a phone number. Someone who'd studied Victor Steiner's life carefully enough to know his routines, his vulnerabilities, his pressure points. Someone who'd found him after 30 years of being dead. Rex whimpered again, a sound like breaking crystal, and Victor felt the last chain holding Der Schatten in check finally snap. The killing was about to start. But first, he needed answers. The phone call came at 9:57 a.m., not to Victor, to Ink, whose cell phone erupted with a ringtone that sounded like gunfire. The young biker answered on the second ring, his voice respectful in a way that made Victor's blood freeze. "Yes, sir. We're here." "No, he hasn't shown himself yet." "Yes, sir. The dog is down." A pause. Victor could hear the tinny echo of a voice through the speaker, too distant to make out words but close enough to catch the accent. European. Familiar in a way that sent ice picks through his skull. Understood. "Should I tell him the name now?" Another pause. Longer this time. Srebrenica. The word hit Victor like a sniper's bullet to the chest. His finger slipped off the Glock's trigger as every muscle in his body locked into paralysis. Srebrenica. July 1995. The day Der Schatten was born in a mass grave outside a UN safe zone that had been anything but safe. The day he'd held a dying child in his arms and sworn an oath that would define the next 20 years of his life. The day everything went wrong. Ink lowered the phone and looked directly at the tree line where Victor was hidden, as if he could see through 50 feet of pine and shadow. Victor Steiner, former Austrian Special Forces, call sign Der Schatten, operational in Bosnia from 1993 to 1996, responsible for the elimination of 17 confirmed war criminals between 1996 and 2015. Webb stopped pacing. Crusher dropped his cigarette. Even Rex seemed to stop breathing. "Your handler wants to have a conversation," Ink continued, his voice carrying across the morning air like a funeral bell. "He says to tell you that Ratko sends his regards from the grave." Ratko. General Ratko Kozlovich, the butcher of Tuzla. Victor's white whale for 15 years before he'd finally cornered him in a Belgrade hotel room in 2009. The man who'd ordered the execution of 8,000 civilians at Srebrenica. The man whose death had sent shockwaves through war criminal networks across 3 continents. The man whose final words had been, "My sons will find you, Shadow. My sons will make you pay." Kozlovic's children. Victor had researched them obsessively after Belgrade, but they'd vanished into the wind. New identities, plastic surgery, witness protection. The International War Crimes Tribunal had assumed they were dead, or at least neutralized. They'd been wrong. Ink's phone rang again. He listened for a moment, then held it out toward the trees. "He wants to talk to you, Victor. Says he's been waiting 30 years for this conversation. 30 years, not 20. Not 15. 30. Which meant this went back further than Bosnia, further than Srebrenica. Back to Austria, maybe. Back to the beginning, when Victor Steiner was just another angry young soldier who thought violence could solve the world's problems. Before he'd learned that violence only created more violence, spiraling outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Rex whimpered, and the sound shattered Victor's paralysis like glass. His dog was dying while he wallowed in ancient history. His dog, Maria's last gift, was bleeding out because someone from his buried past had decided to use grief as a weapon. Victor rose from the ditch like a ghost materializing from shadow. The Glock hung loose in his right hand, not quite pointed at the 3 bikers but close enough to matter. His left hand was empty, showing surrender, but his stance screamed predator. Der Schatten had finally come home. "I'm here," Victor called, his voice carrying the weight of mass graves and burning villages and children who died because men in uniforms couldn't agree on lines drawn on maps. "Let's talk." But even as the words left his mouth, Victor knew that talking was just the prelude. Someone had orchestrated this entire encounter, used his dog as bait, turned his grief into a trap. Someone had studied him long enough to know exactly which pressure points would break his carefully constructed peace. Someone who'd found him after 30 years of being dead. The killing was inevitable now. The only questions were how many would die, and whether Victor Steiner would survive to mourn his dog properly. As Ink held out the phone with a smile that belonged on a corpse, Victor realized that his quiet life in Montana, feeding birds, fixing fence posts, pretending the past was just a nightmare, was over. Some ghosts, it turned out, were patient enough to wait 30 years for their revenge. And some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The phone waited in Ink's outstretched hand like a loaded gun. Victor stepped forward to accept his resurrection. Victor's first instinct was to retreat. The phone sat in Ink's palm like a coiled snake, its black screen reflecting the Montana sky. 30 feet of open ground separated Victor from answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. 30 feet that might as well have been 30 years, bridging the gap between the man who fed birds at dawn and the ghost who'd painted Eastern Europe red with the blood of war criminals. "Just walk away," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible over Rex's labored breathing. "Take Rex to the vet. Disappear again. Let the dead stay buried." But even as the thought formed, Victor knew it was too late. You couldn't unknown a name like Srebrenica. You couldn't unhear Ratko Kozlovic's voice echoing from beyond the grave through the mouths of men who'd driven 800 miles just to watch his dog die. The phone rang again, that same gunfire ringtone that sounded like Kalashnikovs chattering in Sarajevo alleys. Ink didn't answer this time. He just stood there, patient as death, waiting for Victor to cross the killing ground between his old life and whatever fresh hell awaited him. Crusher shifted nervously, his hand drifting toward the gun bulge under his vest. "Jesus, Ink, you didn't tell us this was about some military—" "Shut up." Ink's voice carried an authority that made both older bikers flinch. "You don't know what you're looking at." Webb's tweaker energy had evaporated completely. He stood frozen beside his motorcycle, eyes darting between Victor and the tree line as if expecting more ghosts to materialize from the shadows. "Maybe we should just go, man. This feels wrong. This feels like—" "Like what?" Ink asked, his tone conversational, curious. "Like we're bait." The words hung in the air like smoke from a burning village. Victor felt his chest tighten as the tactical picture shifted in his mind. 3 Hell's Angels, 1 phone call, 800 miles from their home territory to torture an old man's dog on the say-so of someone who knew about Srebrenica. Someone who'd known exactly how Victor would react. Someone who'd counted on Der Schatten clawing his way back to the surface. Rex coughed, a wet sound that meant internal bleeding, and Victor took another step forward. The Glock felt heavier now, weighted with the gravity of inevitability. Maria's voice whispered in his memory, "Promise me you won't go back to that darkness." But the darkness hadn't gone anywhere. It had just been waiting, patient and hungry, for someone to kick in the right door. "Why Rex?" Victor called across the distance. "Why not just come for me directly?" Ink smiled, and it was the coldest thing Victor had seen since watching mass graves being filled in Bosnia. "Because this way is more personal, more educational." The phone buzzed, a text message this time. Ink glanced at the screen, and his smile widened. "He says to ask you about the Celibici camp. Says to ask you about a little girl named Anna who died because you were 5 minutes too late." Victor's knees almost buckled. Anna Markovich, 8 years old, found in the ruins of a detention camp outside Konjic, her small body bearing evidence of horrors no child should endure. Victor had carried her to the medic tent, had held her hand as she died, had sworn an oath over her cooling corpse that would consume the next 20 years of his life. Anna was classified, Black Ops classified, the kind of information that lived in files buried so deep they didn't officially exist, which meant whoever was pulling these strings had access to intelligence networks that should have died with the Cold War. "Still want to walk away, old man?" Ink asked. "Still want to pretend you're just some harmless retiree who feeds birds?" Victor looked down at Rex, at Maria's last gift bleeding out in the gravel of his driveway. The dog's dark eyes found his, trusting and patient even in agony, waiting for his master to fix this the way Victor had always fixed everything before. But some things couldn't be fixed. Some doors, once opened, only swung one way. Victor holstered the Glock and walked across 30 feet of open ground toward a phone call that would resurrect demons he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. His joints creaked with each step, his heart hammered against his ribs, his mouth tasted like copper and cordite and the ashes of promises he'd made to a dying woman. But his hands were steady. Der Schatten was coming home. Ink extended the phone with a theatrical flourish. He's been waiting a long time for this conversation. Victor took the device, noting the tactical calluses on Ink's fingers, the way the younger man's weight stayed balanced on the balls of his feet. Professional, military trained, definitely bait. But bait for what? Victor pressed the phone to his ear and prepared to learn exactly how deep his past was willing to dig. The voice that came through the phone was aged honey over broken glass, smooth, cultured, and absolutely lethal. Victor recognized it immediately, even though he'd heard it only once before, 32 years ago in a basement interrogation room in Graz. "Hello, Victor. You sound older." Colonel Dietrich Hauser, Austrian military intelligence. Victor's first handler, the man who'd recruited a bitter 20-year-old soldier fresh out of basic training and molded him into something that could slip across borders like smoke and eliminate problems that didn't officially exist. The man Victor had supposedly killed in 1991. "You're dead," Victor whispered, his voice cracking like ice on a frozen lake. "Reports of my death, as they say." Hauser's laugh was the sound of children crying in mass graves. "Though I appreciate your commitment to the fiction. That body you left burning in my Vienna apartment was very convincing. Poor Hans, he really did look remarkably like me, didn't he?" Victor's vision grayed at the edges. Hans Brenner, his partner, his friend, the only person who'd known about Victor's plan to fake Hauser's death and disappear before the colonel could activate the kill order that Victor had discovered too late. Hans, who'd volunteered to wear Hauser's clothes, to die in Hauser's apartment, to burn beyond recognition so Victor could escape the machine that had created Der Schatten. Hans, who'd believed they were saving innocent lives by cutting the puppet strings. "You killed him," Victor breathed. "Oh no, you killed him. I simply allowed it to happen. Do you remember what you told him before you lit the match? This is the only way to stop the killing. Such beautiful idealism, such profound stupidity." The phone felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Victor's hand trembled as memories crashed over him like artillery shells. Hans laughing over schnapps in a Salzburg bar, Hans arguing about the morality of their missions, Hans saying someone has to stop this madness, Victor. Someone has to say no. Hans burning alive while Victor escaped into the night, believing he'd killed his handler and freed himself from a system that treated human beings like chess pieces. "The question," Hauser continued, "is whether you've learned anything in the 30 years since, whether Der Schatten has developed a conscience, or if he's still the same naive boy who thinks he can solve complex problems with simple violence. What do you want?" Victor's voice sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. "I want you to remember who you really are. Not this pathetic hermit feeding birds and mourning his dead wife. Not this broken old man who thinks retirement equals redemption. I want you to remember that you belong to me. That you Veilways belonged to me." Rex whimpered again, the sound cutting through Victor's skull like a rusty blade. The dog's breathing was getting shallower. "Minutes, maybe less. The Hell's Angels," Victor started, "are my grandchildren, in a manner of speaking. Not literally, of course, but their fathers served under my command during our Balkan operations. Good men, loyal men, men you murdered in the name of justice." The pieces clicked together like a puzzle made of human bones. The war criminals Victor had hunted weren't just random targets. They'd been Hauser's network, his assets, his legacy soldiers spreading across Eastern Europe like a cancer that Victor had spent 20 years cutting out, one execution at a time. "You sent me after your own people," Victor whispered. "I sent you after problems that needed solving. Some of them had outlived their usefulness. Others had become indiscreet. You were my instrument of quality control, Victor. My way of cleaning house while maintaining plausible deniability." The Montana sky seemed to darken as Victor realized the scope of his manipulation. Every mission, every target, every life he'd taken in the name of justice had actually been a contract killing, orchestrated by the man he'd tried to escape. "Maria knew, didn't she?" Hauser's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. Near the end, when the cancer was eating her brain, did she figure out what you really were? Leave her out of this. Such devotion, such protection of the dead. Tell me, Victor, did you confess your sins to her before she died? Did you tell her about the children who died because Daddy was too busy playing executioner to come home? About the families destroyed because Der Schatten needed to feel important? Each word was a scalpel, cutting deeper than flesh, finding nerve clusters Victor had spent years learning to numb. Maria had never asked about his past. She'd simply loved him, accepted him, tried to build something clean from the wreckage of what he'd become. And now Hauser was taking even that away. Here's what's going to happen, the colonel continued. You're going to start killing again. Starting with these 3 young men standing in your driveway, then you're going to hunt down their associates, their families, their entire bloodline. You're going to do exactly what you did in Bosnia, follow orders and pretend it's justice. Never. Oh, but you will. Because if you don't, I'll release files that will destroy every good memory Maria ever had of you. I'll send evidence to every law enforcement agency in 3 countries. I'll make sure the world knows exactly what Der Schatten did in those mass graves. Victor closed his eyes, feeling the trap closing around him like a coffin lid. Welcome back to work, my boy. I've missed you. The line went dead, but Victor kept the phone pressed to his ear, listening to static that sounded like screaming. 30 years of lies crashing down around him like the walls of Jericho. Every mission, every target, every sleepless night spent believing he was making the world cleaner. All of it orchestrated by a dead man who'd never been dead at all. You look like you've seen a ghost, Ink said, plucking the phone from Victor's numb fingers. Or maybe you just realized you are one. Victor stared at the 3 bikers standing in his driveway, seeing them with new eyes. Not random thugs, not even Hell's Angels seeking revenge for dead fathers. They were props in someone else's theater, actors who didn't even know they were following a script written before they were born. But there was something else, something in Ink's voice, in the way he held himself, that didn't fit Hauser's narrative. How old are you? Victor asked suddenly. Ink blinked, caught off guard by the question. What? Your age. How old? 26. Why does that? Ratko Kozlovich died in 2009. You would have been 11 years old. Victor's voice was gaining strength, clarity cutting through the fog of manipulation. If your father was one of his officers, you'd barely remember him. Certainly not enough to drive 800 miles for revenge. Something flickered across Ink's face. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. Webb and Crusher exchanged glances, sensing the shift in dynamics they didn't understand. And another thing, Victor continued, his tactical mind finally breaking free from Hauser's psychological warfare. You knew too much. The classified details about Anna Markovic, about Silobici camp, that intelligence was compartmentalized, need to know only. Even Hauser's own assets wouldn't have had access. Ink's hand drifted toward his weapon, but Victor was already moving, 3 decades of muscle memory overriding conscious thought. The Glock appeared in his hand like magic, muzzle centered on Ink's chest. So here's what I think happened, Victor said, his voice dropping into the register that had made hardened war criminals weep. I think Hauser fed you a story about revenge and dead fathers. I think he told you I was some broken old man who'd roll over and surrender. But you've been asking the wrong questions. What questions? Ink whispered. Like why would a 70-year-old spy master emerge from 3 decades of hiding just to torture an old man's dog? Like what could possibly be worth exposing his entire network for a psychological game? Victor saw it then, the moment Ink realized he'd been played as thoroughly as everyone else. The young man's face went pale as understanding dawned. He's not after me, Victor said, pieces falling into place with mechanical precision. He never was. This whole elaborate setup, the dog, the phone call, the psychological torture, it was all to get me angry enough to do exactly what I'm about to do. Which is what? Crusher asked, though his voice suggested he didn't want to know. Kill you. Victor's smile was colder than a Serbian winter. All 3 of you, right here, right now, in self-defense. Because that's what the cameras are recording. 3 sets of eyes darted toward the tree line. suddenly understanding that they weren't the hunters in this scenario. Hauser needs bodies, Victor continued. Fresh kills to pin on der Schatten. Evidence of my return to active status. Proof that the monster is out of his cage. He paused, letting the implications sink in. The question is, what's worth framing a dead man to cover up? Ink's phone buzzed with a text message. His face went ashen as he read it. What does it say? Victor asked. It says, Ink swallowed hard. Eliminate the asset. Orders are orders. The three bikers stared at the message, finally understanding their true position in Hauser's chess game. They weren't weapons, they were evidence to be disposed of. Here's Hauser's mistake, Victor said, lowering the Glock slightly. He thinks I'm still the same naive boy who believed in justice and clean endings. He thinks I'll kill you because he ordered it, or because I'm angry about Rex, or because I can't help myself. Won't you? Webb asked. Victor looked down at his dog, at Maria's last gift bleeding in the gravel, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. Not the resurrection of der Schatten, but its final burial. Hauser had orchestrated this entire encounter expecting the old Victor to emerge, the one who solved problems with violence, who followed orders disguised as moral imperatives. But Maria had changed him. 5 years of feeding birds, of quiet mornings and gentle evenings, of learning to build instead of destroy. Hauser's arrogance was complete. He believed Victor Steiner was still his weapon to command. He was about to learn how wrong dead men could be. No, Victor said quietly. I'm not going to kill you. I'm going to do something much worse. What? I'm going to save you. The three Hell's Angels stared at Victor as if he'd announced his intention to sprout wings and fly. In their world, salvation came from the barrel of a gun or the edge of a blade, not from the mercy of a man they'd been sent to destroy. Save us? Ink's voice cracked like a teenager's. From what? From becoming the latest casualties in Hauser's house-cleaning operation. Victor holstered the Glock, a gesture that somehow felt more threatening than keeping it drawn. You think that text message was the first? You think he hasn't already activated backup plans to eliminate witnesses? As if summoned by Victor's words, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines echoed through the mountain passes, not the irregular growl of touring bikes, but the synchronized thunder of military precision. Victor counted at least 6 engines, maybe 8, approaching fast along the single mountain road that led to his ranch. Jesus Christ, Crusher breathed, his face going pale beneath the tattoos. Those aren't angels. No, Victor agreed, already moving toward Rex's motionless form. They're cleanup crew, probably ex-military contractors Hauser keeps on retainer for situations exactly like this. He knelt beside his dog, pressing his palm against the German shepherd's chest. Weak heartbeat but steady, still time. Why would he want us dead? Webb's tweaker energy had transformed into pure panic. We did what he asked. We hurt the dog, we delivered the message. Because you can identify him. Because you know about the phone calls and the coordination. Victor scooped Rex into his arms, feeling the dog's blood seep through his shirt. Because in Hauser's world, the only good witness is a dead witness. The engine sounds were getting closer, maybe 2 minutes out. Victor's tactical mind shifted into overdrive, calculating angles and distances, weapons and cover, escape routes and kill zones. 30 years of muscle memory flooding back like a dam bursting. But this time, he wasn't planning to kill. He was planning to disappear. We can't outrun them on the main road, he told the bikers, who were still standing frozen in his driveway like deer in headlights. But I know these mountains. I know places Hauser's boys will never find. Why should we trust you? Ink demanded, though his voice lacked conviction. The approaching engines had stripped away all his practiced arrogance, revealing the frightened young man underneath. Victor paused in his movement toward the barn, Rex's weight heavy in his arms. Because 32 years ago, I trusted someone who promised to help me escape a system that treated human beings like ammunition. He died for that trust, burned alive while I ran into the night thinking I was free. The words came out harder than he intended, carved from stone and heartbreak and 3 decades of survivor's guilt. Hans Brenner's face flashed through his memory. Young, idealistic, believing they could fight monsters without becoming monsters themselves. I won't let Hauser add 3 more names to that list, Victor continued. Not even yours. Crusher was the first to move, his massive frame surprisingly quick as he jogged toward the barn. Fuck it. Better than waiting here to get shot. Webb followed, then Inc., the young man's tactical training finally overriding his confusion. They reached Victor just as he kicked open the barn door, revealing shadows that smelled of hay and motor oil and secrets. There's a trail that leads up through Glacier Pass, Victor explained, settling Rex gently on a pile of horse blankets. Follows an old mining route from the 1920s. It'll take us up above the tree line, then down into Canada through Waterton Lakes. On foot? Webb's voice cracked. With them chasing us? Not on foot. Victor pulled a canvas tarp away from the back corner of the barn, revealing something that made all 3 bikers whistle in appreciation. A 1970 Kawasaki H1 Mach 3, pristine and deadly, its engine modified for high-altitude performance. Next to it, a matching pair of dirt bikes and an old military ATV that looked like it could climb the face of Mount Rushmore. Maria bought me the Kawasaki for my 60th birthday, Victor said, running his hand along the fuel tank. Said a man my age needed something fast enough to outrun his past. His voice caught slightly. Turned out she was more right than she knew. The sound of engines was much closer now, maybe a quarter mile down the mountain road. Through the barn's side window, Victor could see dust clouds rising through the trees. They'll have thermal imaging, night vision, probably satellite coordination, he warned the bikers as they mounted the bikes. This isn't going to be a chase. It's going to be a war. Inc. looked up from kickstarting one of the dirt bikes. Then why are you doing this? Why risk everything to save 3 strangers who came here to destroy your life? Victor lifted Rex carefully onto the ATV, securing the unconscious dog with bungee cords. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications he wasn't sure he could articulate, because Maria had taught him that mercy was stronger than vengeance, because Hans Brenner had died believing in something better, because 30 years of killing had taught him that the only victory worth having was the one that let you sleep at night. Because, Victor said, firing up the Kawasaki's engine, someone has to break the cycle. The sound of gunfire erupted from his driveway as Hauser's cleanup crew arrived to find empty motorcycles and blood in the gravel. But no bodies, and no Der Schatten. Just an old man, 3 unlikely allies, and a wounded dog disappearing into the Montana wilderness like ghosts fleeing toward redemption. The mountain trail carved through granite and regret, each switchback taking them higher into air so thin it burned the lungs. Victor leaned into the Kawasaki's curves, Rex secured behind him, the dog's shallow breathing the only sound louder than the engines screaming through alpine silence. Behind them, muzzle flashes lit up the tree line like deadly fireflies. Contact rear! Inc's voice crackled through the wind as bullets sparked off stone 6 inches from his front tire. The cleanup crew had found their trail faster than expected, military-grade night vision cutting through darkness like scalpels. Victor didn't respond. He was calculating distances, trajectories, the precise moment when Hauser's arrogance would finally destroy him. Because this chase wasn't random, it was orchestrated. Every turn, every tactical decision designed to drive them toward a specific destination. The old Celebici mine shaft, where Hans Brenner had died 32 years ago, burning alive while Victor escaped into a night that had lasted 3 decades. Where Hauser was waiting to finish what they'd started, when the Berlin Wall still cast shadows across Europe and young men still believed in clean endings. Victor! Crusher's panicked shout echoed off canyon walls as the ATV's engine began to sputter. Something's wrong with this piece of shit. Victor glanced back to see Webb clinging to Crusher's massive frame, both of them bouncing on a machine that was hemorrhaging oil and hope in equal measure. The thermal imaging had been a distraction. Hauser's real weapon was patience. He'd sabotaged the ATV during one of his surveillance visits, ensuring they'd be stranded at exactly the right coordinates. "Abandon it," Victor called, slowing the Kawasaki as the trail narrowed toward a bottleneck that would funnel them into perfect killing position. Double up on the bikes! But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was too late. The cleanup crew's engines were getting closer, and ahead, blocking the path like a tombstone, stood a figure Victor recognized from 32 years of nightmares, Colonel Friedrich Hauser. 73 years old, silver-haired, wearing the same expression of patient satisfaction he'd worn, while explaining the necessity of war crimes to young soldiers who still believed in honor. "Hello, Victor." Hauser's voice carried perfectly in the thin air, amplified by canyon acoustics and the weight of buried history. "I was wondering when you'd finally come home." Victor killed the Kawasaki's engine, the sudden silence so complete it felt like suffocation. Behind him, Rex stirred weakly, the dogs breathing a reminder of everything Hauser had taken from him. Around them, the mountain walls rose like the sides of a grave. "Hans is buried 50 meters up that trail," Hauser continued, gesturing toward the mine shaft with casual precision. "Did you know that? All these years, you've been feeding birds 2 miles from your handler's bones." The 3 bikers had dismounted, clustering behind Victor like children seeking protection from a monster their parents had promised didn't exist. But Victor wasn't looking at them. He was staring at Hauser's eyes, seeing the same cold intelligence that had turned idealistic young soldiers into instruments of calculated horror. "You orchestrated everything," Victor said. His voice was steady, but inside, 30 years of carefully constructed peace was crumbling like ancient masonry. "The dog, the phone calls, driving us here. This was never about revenge or cleanup operations." "Oh, but it was about cleanup." Hauser smiled, the expression containing all the warmth of a Siberian winter. "You see, certain files have surfaced. Certain witnesses have started talking. My work in Bosnia, my networks in Eastern Europe, it's all becoming rather complicated. So you need Der Schatten to take the blame. I need Der Schatten to confess, publicly, dramatically, before putting a bullet in his own head rather than face justice." Hauser's tone suggested he was discussing the weather. Imagine the headlines: "Notorious war criminals' final victims include innocent American bikers." Very tragic, very final. Victor felt the trap closing around him like the walls of the mine shaft where Hans had died. But this time, he wasn't the naive boy who believed in simple solutions. Maria had taught him that some battles weren't won with weapons. They were won with witness. "Ink," Victor said quietly, never taking his eyes off Hauser. "Is your phone recording?" The young man's hand moved instinctively to his pocket. "What?" "The confession function. Is it active?" Understanding dawned across Ink's tattooed features as he realized what Victor was doing. Not planning an escape, planning to expose everything, to break the cycle not with violence, but with truth. "You magnificent bastard," Hauser breathed, recognizing the maneuver too late. "You're not here to die. You're here to make me talk." "I'm here to finish what Hans Brenner started," Victor replied, his hand moving slowly toward the weapon he wouldn't need to draw. "Someone has to say no, Colonel. Someone has to stop the killing, even if it costs you everything." Victor looked down at Rex, at Maria's final gift still breathing despite everything Hauser had done to break them both, especially then. The mountain silence stretched between them like a held breath, past and present finally colliding in the place where heroes went to die. Hauser's laugh echoed off canyon walls like the sound of breaking glass. "You think anyone will believe a dead man's testimony? You think uploading some grainy recording will matter when Der Schatten's body is found beside 3 innocent bikers?" He gestured to his cleanup crew, shadows with weapons emerging from the tree line. "I've been orchestrating cover-ups since before you learned to kill, boy." "Maybe," Victor said, his hand steady on the Glock's grip, "but Maria taught me something you never understood, Colonel." "What's that?" "Sometimes the smallest witness carries the loudest voice." Victor whistled sharp, commanding, the same sound he'd used to call Rex home every evening for 5 years. The German shepherd's head lifted weakly from the ATV's bed, amber eyes finding his master's face. "Record," Victor commanded. Rex's collar, Maria's final gift, equipped with a veterinary monitoring system, began transmitting everything to cloud servers scattered across 3 continents. Not just audio, but GPS coordinates, biometric data, the digital fingerprint of a man's final stand. Hauser's expression shifted from satisfaction to calculation, clever but ultimately pointless. Is it? Victor stepped forward, and something in his movement made the cleanup crew hesitate. Not Der Schatten emerging, but something far more dangerous, a man who'd learned to choose his deaths carefully. Tell me, Colonel, how many other operations are you covering up? How many other witnesses need silencing? The recording captured everything. Hauser's unconscious nod, the slight smile that confirmed decades of buried atrocities, the casual gesture toward coordinates where other bodies lay hidden in Montana soil. You want a confession? Hauser's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Here's your confession. Yes, I eliminated witnesses. Yes, I manufactured evidence. Yes, I turned young soldiers into weapons and discarded them when they became inconvenient. His smile widened. And yes, I'll do it again tomorrow, because that's how the world actually works. The mountain held its breath. Thank you, Victor said softly. That's all we needed. The gunfire, when it came, lasted less than 30 seconds, but it wasn't Victor who drew first, it was ink. Trained reflexes overriding terror as Hauser's cleanup crew moved to eliminate their digital witness. The young biker died protecting a truth he'd never expected to carry, his body shielding the phone that continued recording. Victor moved through the chaos like a man swimming through memory, each shot placed with surgical precision. Not Der Schatten's killing rage, but something colder, the calculated efficiency of someone who understood that some deaths prevented others. When the silence returned, Hauser lay bleeding against granite, his breath coming in shallow gasps that echoed Hans Brenner's final moments. The cleanup crew was scattered among the rocks like broken toys, their thermal imaging equipment useless against a man who'd learned to become invisible in plain sight. You killed them all, Hauser whispered, confusion replacing arrogance as his life leaked into mountain soil. No, Victor said, kneeling beside Rex, checking the dog's pulse with hands surprisingly gentle for their recent work. I saved them. Ink's recording is already uploading to servers in 12 countries. Your entire network is about to become very public knowledge. Hauser's eyes widened with understanding. The phones, they're still transmitting. Maria was a software engineer before she became a therapist, Victor explained, his voice carrying the weight of 5 years' grief finally finding purpose. She spent her last months building safeguards, insurance policies, ways to ensure that if something happened to us, the truth would survive. The old colonel tried to speak, but death was faster than words. Victor carried Rex down the mountain on foot, following trails only deer and dead men knew. Behind them, federal agencies were already responding to automated alerts triggered by Maria's final gift evidence that would unravel 3 decades of carefully constructed lies. He found Crusher and Webb hiding in an abandoned ranger station, both men staring at him like he'd returned from a particularly violent resurrection. Is it over? Webb asked. Victor settled Rex on a Park Service cot, watching his dog's breathing slowly strengthen. It's over. But that wasn't quite true. 3 days later, standing beside a small grave marker in Glacier Pass where Hans Brenner's remains had finally been recovered, Victor understood that some endings were actually beginnings. Rex pressed against his leg, the dog's recovery as complete as his master's long-delayed peace. Around them, mourning birds sang the same songs Maria had loved, carrying promises of springs yet to come. The truth had teeth, as she'd always said. Sometimes it just took 30 years to find the right moment to bite. Victor Steiner walked home through forest light, finally free to feed the birds without watching the shadows for ghosts who would never return. Some stories ended with justice. Others ended with something rarer. Forgiveness earned through the simple act of choosing life over vengeance, mercy over the machinery of endless war.